This week on Just Solutions, what's the future for democracy in Florida? Governor Ron DeSantis is rarely out of the national news, from signing bills that restrict discussions on gender, sexual orientation and race in public schools, to efforts to restrict abortion access. Now, a new congressional map, which was proposed by DeSantis himself, will dilute the power of black voters in the state. Our guest today is Dwight Bullard, a former state senator and now a senior advisor to the group Florida Rising. That's one of the organisations that has filed a lawsuit challenging Florida's new congressional map. So what is happening in Florida, and why should the rest of the country be paying attention? From Free Speech TV, Just Solutions. Dwight, it's great to have you with us. Thank you very much for being our guest today.
Thank you for having me.
Now, in the introduction, we outlined some of the more recent bills signed by DeSantis, in addition to the redistricting. But going back, even last year and prior to that, there were even more bills that are very much just attacking progressive values and free speech. And we'll talk about those in just a minute. But I do want to start with this discussion about what's happening with redistricting, because as we are finding out, this is part of an effort to create even more barriers for voters who want to engage in the democratic process. So take us through exactly what is happening right now. I know a lawsuit is now, in play as well, but what is this redistricting map that DeSantis is backing?
Well, just so viewers understand this, every 10 years we have the census here in the United States. And then a year to 2 years after that, each state has to go through this process known as reapportionment and redistricting, meaning that whether it's an independent committee or the state legislature has to draw the maps based on population. And so our state legislature in our Constitution is tasked with the drawing of these maps for the state house, state senate, and Congress. Florida gained an additional seat this year because our population grew. And so now we have 28 congressional seats. We also passed in 2010 an addition to our Constitution known as fair districts, which required that the legislature make sure that there were protections, make sure that there was something as close to parity, because we are a 50-50 state here in Florida, that you have Democratic seats, Republican seats, and then seats that do not sway either party, but are competitive for both entities. And so the state legislature drew those maps. They did their job. The governor has veto power over only one of those maps, and that's the congressional map. And so Governor DeSantis vetoed the map that was produced by the state legislature during our regular session, brought the legislators back to Tallahassee in a special session. And instead of drawing a new map as they are required to do, they abdicated that to Governor DeSantis, who drew a very biased, very racially charged map, because under our Constitution, Florida has what's known as protected seats because of the history of not having Black representation in Congress. So in 1992, the first maps to allow Black Congresspeople to serve had been drawn. There's been a growth of that population since. So we started off with 3 members, expanded to 4, and now we have 5. Governor DeSantis's map cuts that in half. The 4 Democratic-leaning Black congressional districts were going to be chopped down to 2, thus cutting Black representation in Congress in half. I've gone on record as saying that this is in fact racist by its definition. He used the power of his office to diminish and regress Black representation in Congress. And by that act is in fact racist. And so I've made no bones about calling the governor out for what he actually is.
Can you explain a little bit more about what those protected seats mean in terms of representation for Black communities? Does it mean that these are communities that are overwhelmingly Black constituents, or does it mean that it's guaranteed that there's going to be a Black representative representing them? What does that protected status mean?
Yeah, and I'm glad you asked the question, because I think a lot of people make the assumption that these congressional districts are 80 or 90% African American. What by protected and by Black access, this just simply means that these are districts where the percentages could range anywhere from 25 to 45 to maybe even 50 in terms of Black constituency in those districts, and thus giving at least the opportunity for those historically Black communities to elect a candidate of their choice. There's no guarantee that it's going to be a Black candidate, but the reality is that we have elected Black public officials to serve in Congress. The districts in question are currently represented by Congressman Al Lawson and Congresswoman Val Demings. In northern Florida, which the district spanned from Jacksonville to Tallahassee, and then in central Florida in the Orlando region.
You yourself have served in the state Senate in Florida, so you know what it's like to be a Black politician essentially in this state. Take us back to that, and what was your campaign like, your election process like, and then what was it like to actually serve in the state government in Florida? You know, take us through that through the prism of what we've just talked about, that the fact that these protected seats were created in acknowledgement that there's a history of denying Black communities representation in Florida.
Yeah, so interestingly enough, my time of service in public office had to do with this as well, because the Voting Rights Act of 1965 basically held states that had not elected Black public officials accountable to do so. And so the state Senate district that I represented, although not by any means overwhelmingly African American, I think the numbers bore out that I had about 28% African American population in my district, but it was a district that was drawn to make sure that counties that had never elected a Black state senator or a Black state representative would, in some way, shape, or form, have some level of representation for the Black communities within those counties. And so I was honored to serve in that capacity. I definitely believe my time of service was one that was people-centered. I know, we're having a conversation to some degree about race, but it really goes to show you that the African-American experience in this country is very much rooted in the American experience. And so I think everyone wants clean water, clean air, affordable place to live, access to healthcare, access to education, and kind of an overall just life. They want a government that will, protect them when necessary, but also give them the freedoms and the liberties that they deserve. And I think that's a universal thread for most folks. So when you see acts like what Governor DeSantis is doing, it literally strikes at the core of people's basic expectation of what government should be. Not overreaching, a just government. That is what folks want. And the idea that any one individual will use the power of his position to put another group of people in harm's way or to create more barriers towards the basic needs that they need shows you a lack of leadership on the part of Governor DeSantis. I would like to say I was the antithesis of that. I was all about building coalitions. I have multiple examples of, folks who are not like-minded coming together around issues that concern children or that concern the best interests of Floridians. And so it would be hopeful that anyone who tries to aspire to be governor or president of the United States would be similar in mindset to want to, at least in their best efforts, bring the state or the country together and not rip it further apart.
Well, now you're with Florida Rising, and I know that's part of a movement of rising groups in mainly southern states that really have emerged in the wake of what Stacey Abrams experienced some years ago, and then her work through Georgia Rising. And so much of that was focusing on voter suppression and how those voter suppression tactics really particularly impacted voters of color. But when we get back to the redistricting, of course, voting access is crucial to that. But I know that redistricting also impacts resources going to districts, the money that will be available for public facilities. And I know Florida Rising has a huge campaign right now trying to educate people about the huge importance of redistricting, of course, voting rights, but talk about some of those other issues as well.
Yeah. So when you're talking about congressional representation, you're talking about millions, if not billions of dollars from the federal government trickling back down into the states. These are for things like public transportation, for healthcare benefits for the elderly and the young and the indigent, resources coming in for in the form of institutional support for universities and schools. And so when you do not have the right mix of people up in Washington advocating for that, you start to lose those resources. And so, of course, a lot of the work that Florida Rising is doing is really trying to dig into what have been historically marginalized communities that have not had the best representation, have not had the best access, to remind them why their vote, why their participation in the small d democracy that we live in is critical to their very existence. A lot of people kind of get turned off by the notion of politics, which I get when someone is doing the exact opposite of what they're saying. That can be irritating at times, and folks want to withdraw from that. But our argument is that by that very notion that someone is not being a representative of your needs is when you need to dig in even deeper and move even further and be more dynamic about your participation in this thing called democracy. This is an experiment. It's been an experiment, since 1776. And it's been exclusionary, unfortunately, of a number of folks. And so for those communities that have felt that exclusion, Florida Rising wants to lean in and make sure that they understand that they are important to this process and are as important as anyone else. So it has nothing to do with wealth or wealth access. It has to do with you as an individual having that right to vote, using it, and then using your mouth, your technology, your feet to advocate for the best interests of your communities. We've seen that happen in places like Georgia, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Arizona, and so many other states. And so we're happy to be part of a larger, national network of folks who are out here really trying to do the work to make sure that communities understand that they are the battery in the back of democracy.
Well, I definitely want to talk about how what's happening in Florida impacts what's happening in the rest of the country. But just briefly, Dwight, what is happening now with the redistricting and the legal challenge to that?
Yeah, so Florida Rising, as well as a number of other groups, have joined in on a lawsuit that basically calls to task the governor for what he's done. And we understand that, as I mentioned before, what he did was outside the normal space of what he's, the normal scope of work that he's normally charged with. Moreover, it again does not reflect what we know a legal map to be in the state of Florida. And so that's really the base of our lawsuit, is that the governor went beyond the pale in terms of what his role as an executive official should be. And then moreover, violated our state constitution as well as the Voting Rights Act in the presentation of this map. And just so folks understand the math, as I mentioned before, the goal is to get as close to parity as possible in a state where, you have a 50-50 split roughly, or actually a 33-33 split between Republicans, Democrats, and non-party affiliate folks. And his map gives 20 seats to Republicans and 8 seats to Democrats, which is a clear, in our opinion, clear violation of the Voting Rights Act and our state constitution.
Well, we'd love to hear from our viewers on this. Weigh in, join the conversation, drop us a comment. Maybe you're in Florida, you have thoughts on this, or maybe you're in a different state and you've been watching what's happening, wondering, well, why should I care about Florida? Well, that's something I want to talk about now, Dwight. Why what's happening in Florida is so significant to the rest of the country. And some of the bills that we mentioned, the Don't Say Gay bill, which basically bans the discussion around gender identity or sexual orientation in public schools. The Stop Woke Act, which targets teaching of race or discussions of race, not just in public schools, but in work situations. There are so many things. And even last year in 2021, there was a HB1 that targeted protests that made even greater penalties for people essentially involved in protests. There's example after example of these bills that attack civil liberties. Of course, the anti-abortion bill that's just been passed as well. We're seeing some copycat bills now leaking out into other states. An example of that is in Ohio, considering a similar to the Don't Say Gay bill. But what is the impact when we have legislation being passed in a state like Florida on the rest of the country, when we are seeing so many copycat bills popping up and also such a similar organizations supporting them in different state houses?
Well, it shows you the unfortunate power of organized money, right? Is that you have these very right-wing, very violent, in my opinion, organizations that are in support of legislation that really undermines, the very fabric of who we are as human beings, right? The root notion of being humane and treating our neighbors as ourselves, right? And so when you see bills like Don't Say Gay or Stop Woke, not only is Florida really kind of a testing ground for some of this bad policy, but once it passes here, it ends up trickling down into other states. Florida is the third largest state in the country. And as a result, other smaller states look to Florida and say, well, if a place that has, all these beaches and Disney World and all these great amenities is passing such corrosive legislation, then for us in a state where we're already actively oppressing our electorate shouldn't be, a big deal, right? And we really have to stop that conversation from taking place. We have to really do away with that notion, because what we're finding is that these bills, as they're not only being duplicated in other places, are putting entire communities in danger. I mean, think about the notion of why there has been a gay and lesbian rights movement in this country is because you were having cases of high rates of suicide, depression, etc., because folks could not live as their true selves. And so now that you are limiting the notion of conversation in schools, so what then is a child who's now discovering that they are same gender loving? What are they to do now in a space that does not allow them to be who they are? It really goes against what we talk about in terms of school, where we expect our children to discover themselves in these places. We want our children to, enjoy athletics, to enjoy the notion of figuring out their own political ideology. So the idea that we're now putting them in a position where they can't experience who they are in the fullest sense of the word really does put them in danger psychologically, physically, and so many other spaces. Stop Woke Act, similarly, right? This idea of destroying the discussion of race in a world in which literally 2 years ago, you see a man killed on national television by the name of George Floyd. And it really prompted a necessary discussion around how this country treats its marginalized citizens. And so what you saw coming from that was what I viewed as a positive step. Businesses cities, individual community groups now having really robust discussions about the racial dynamics that exist in this country. And so the idea that the right would like to undermine that by trying to pass legislation that now says those discussions are illegal, and anyone promoting those discussions should be outed or fired for having these discussions. And we're seeing a, a chilling effect across the country where teachers are now being fired because they're choosing to introduce Toni Morrison books to their students because they're reading books like The Color Purple or The Bluest Eye, or because elementary school teachers are bringing books that have been around for decades, like Ezra Jack Keats and other authors that center Black characters in their books. You're having parents, call these hotlines or send these emails to their state departments of education saying, how dare they be teaching my child about these kinds of things? And it'd be laughable if it wasn't so dangerous. And we as a collective, as a conscious collective, have to be about the business of really pushing back against these absolute threats to our everyday existence.
To continue why the rest of the country needs to be paying attention to Florida, I don't think it's a surprise for many people to hear that it seems DeSantis has his own presidential ambitions. So how much of what he's doing right now plays into that? Is it part of a broader political strategy?
It is absolutely part of a broader political strategy. I mean, we just saw a report that came out yesterday that Florida is now the most expensive state to live in, right? So we have an affordable housing crisis. You would think when you see a publication like that a state leader who cared about his state would say, well, that is the hot button issue that we need to address. We have people that are now being forced out of their homes because landlords are jacking up their rents by 30, 40, 50%, from year to year. Folks that are now having to live in motels, folks that are now having to live in their cars, not because they don't have a job, but because their job doesn't pay them enough to live in a state that's becoming increasingly more expensive. You would think that would be the priority. You would think in a state where 1 out of 6 people, who should have a greater access to healthcare are finding themselves dying because of limited access to resources around healthcare access would be a priority. You would think in a state, again, that suffers from climate change in multiple facets, whether it be sea level rise to a rising heat index, that you might prioritize those things. But when you're auditioning to be president, or more importantly, the president of the far right extremists, you do things like this. You engage in these unnecessary pieces of legislation to throw red meat at the base that you hope will, move you past former President Trump into the next stratosphere of aggressive, right-wing, anti-democratic presidents that seem to be coming out of one section of our country. And so, again, for folks who believe in the notion of democracy, whether it be theoretically or just in the core of your belief that we are truly a government that should be by the people and for the people, then you have to be watching and paying attention to the moves of Ron DeSantis, because he is auditioning to be president of the United States. These bills that he's signing, they aren't in any way indicative of the makeup of Florida. I mean, Florida is one of the leading states in terms of number of pride festivals in the country, right? So why would you then sign a bill that strikes at the heart of the gay and lesbian community? Florida has a rising population of Black and brown people that, again, in the next 10 years, Florida will be a quote unquote minority majority state. So why is Stop Woke is something you're doing if you see the tide changing, unless you're trying to send a message to folks in other states like Iowa and New Hampshire, that you are trying to preserve, protect, and take America back to a place where those communities were unfortunately not protected and not represented, to a very dark day in the American past, where Black and brown people, gay and lesbian folks, marginalized communities could not show up and participate in this thing called government. And so that is what Ron DeSantis hopes to do, and he's hoping that his appeal to you will be enough to put him in striking distance of the White House.
Well, we just have a couple of minutes left, Dwight, but do you think what's happening now with Disney and the efforts by Florida to remove their special district status, being in the crosshairs of such a huge international corporation, is things like, will things like that make any kind of a difference?
Well, this is a message, he's sending a clear message to Disney and other corporate interests that, if it's true that your money can move mountains, then he's saying to you, in essence, screw you, And so for those corporate interests out there that think he's somehow going to play nice if you are more restrictive, you got another thing coming. And so what I would say to those corporate interests that are out there, join the side, be on the right side of history with organizations like Florida Rising and others, fighting to preserve and save democracy and save, the state of Florida and the country from itself, from its worst self, and join forces with us, because we collectively can push back against this. It doesn't have to be this way, and we have to fight for what is right.
And for people to follow what's happening with redistricting, because that ties in so well with what you were just saying there about how there's a very different makeup of Floridians than maybe is being represented by these elected officials. Of course, so much of that goes back to redistricting. The website, floridarising.org, I know has a lot of information. Is that a good place to follow what's happening with this lawsuit, trying to block it?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Please do look us up on floridarising.org. We encourage folks to join us, become members. Even if you don't live in Florida and want to help engage in the fight in Florida, I definitely encourage you to do so. I would also say the same thing for the freedom fighters in other states, whether it be New Georgia Project, Lucha in Arizona, Detroit Action in Michigan, and so many others that are doing this great work. But I would also encourage you all to check us out on social media. FL Rising, at FL Rising on Twitter and Instagram. We also have a Facebook page. You got to get into this fight with us. We outnumber the worst of us. I do firmly believe that, but we do have to show force in this moment that the good do outweigh the evil.
Dwight Bullard with Florida Rising. It's been great to have you as our guest on Just Solutions. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you.
And don't forget that Just Solutions is also available as a podcast. So subscribe to it wherever you get your podcasts, listen to back episodes, and never miss future episodes. And you can catch all of our previous shows at our website, freespeech.org. And don't forget, join us same time, same place next week for another conversation on Just Solutions from Free Speech TV.